I would love to now invite Alex Beard, Senior Director at Diploma Learning Lab at Teach for All, and lead researcher of the missing piece, to frame the conversation we'll be having, to present his key findings from the report on the importance of collective leadership development as a driver for systemic change.
The context for this report is that we're in a moment globally where we really need to achieve improvements in education. Recent research shows that about 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries are getting to that age without being able to read a simple sentence for meaning. And that's about 60% of all children globally who are getting towards the end of primary school without achieving the basics they need in their learning. That's hundreds of millions of students who aren't mastering the basics, let alone developing as the leaders we know we need them to be to shape a better future for themselves and for us as well. At the same time, while there have been many improvements in getting children into school in recent decades, there haven't been big improvements in learning. In fact, if you look at the recent PISA results, you can see about a 15-year decline all around the world in what children at age 15 know and are able to do. If you look across education systems over the past decades, the average levels of learning in the average school globally haven't really improved, have stagnated in many places, and in some places even seem to have declined. And we think that technical solutions, good policies that are well implemented are utterly vital to improving education, that alone, this focus on scaling solutions, taking evidence-based approaches to improving learning alone is not going to be sufficient to solve this crisis. And more research that we see coming out today, for example, from the RISE program, which studied multiple education systems over a 10-year period and published a lot of very interesting research, including this final piece of Focus to Flourish. They have basically shown that with these technical solutions in the education systems worldwide that are improving quickly, that are improving against the odds, yes, there are technical solutions that are being implemented well at scale. But at the same time, those same solutions are often in play in education systems where change isn't happening or where learning outcomes are actually declining. And they identified a set of different factors which actually distinguish those education systems that are getting better. One of those, and perhaps the most important, is this sense that there's a shared purpose, not just in those education systems, but right across government and throughout civil society around education. And that purpose may be foundational learning. It may be education for nation building. It may be education for student well-being. But what's important is that there is a clear shared purpose in those systems that seem to be improving. And there's coherence. People are working together with shared plans, a shared sense of direction, doing activities that complement one another. And so we've learned from this research, and also we've been learning ourselves internally. So there's this crisis, but we as a network have been learning about what it might take to solve this crisis for a long time. So for 15 years or more, there have been Teachful network partners, developing leaders who work together in communities with one another and partners to try to bring about change. For the past 5 years, we've been studying the lessons learned by those leaders, with those leaders. We've involved about 600 network leaders in learning experiences. We've piloted multiple learning experiences for organizations in our network. We've learned with and from organizations globally about what it might take to transform education. And through all this, we came to this conclusion that there was a missing piece in our efforts to transform education around the world. And I thank Shaheen for this title. So we believe that systemic change in education will only come about if we can match our investments in technical solutions with parallel investments in developing collective leadership. We think that the people side of change is really underinvested in, and it hasn't been a big enough focus of our global community, where the policy side of change has been. But we think it's those two things, people plus policy, or collective leadership plus technical solutions, working together, complementing each other, that will bring systemic change about. So in this report, we set out to understand better what we meant by this idea of collective leadership. We've been talking about it for several years as a network without ever really defining it clearly. So that's what you'll be able to read in our report, The Missing Piece, which I urge you to take a look at after this call if you haven't already. We're officially launching it with these calls today and yesterday. And it begins with this general definition of collective leadership. So the People First community, who are a coalition of development organizations, not only in education, commissioned an evidence review that was carried out by a number of global researchers that looked at the current evidence about collective leadership. And they generated this definition for collective leadership, which could work in any development sector or even in the private sector or elsewhere. They say that collective leadership is a group of people making meaning together to find direction that coordinates their interdependent actions to achieve a socially useful outcome that each would not have produced on their own. And they say that collective leadership, therefore, is a type of work that members of the group do together. It's not about a formal position. It's not about calling individuals leaders. It's a type of activity, collective leadership, that groups of people can do if the right conditions are met. So we use this definition as the basis of our work. And then we went out and brought together a group of 9 of the organizations, 9 of the network partners across Teach for All in Peru, Chile, Mexico, the US, Nigeria, Austria, Bulgaria, Armenia, and India, to develop case studies to explore in a bit more depth what collective leadership looked like, specifically in our network, in education, how it's being developed, and how it might be contributing to system change. Here's where we arrived in terms of what collective leadership is. We identified these 4 key characteristics. So remember, this is working in tandem with new technical solutions. So you see people at all levels of the ecosystem around children exercising leadership and agency. So that's in the education system, but also beyond the education system, right through different levels of the community, in the public sector, in the private sector. It means teachers, students, school leaders, policymakers, community leaders, parents are playing a role. It's important that these groups are locally rooted and diverse. So they know the context deeply, they're rooted in it. And they also represent a range of backgrounds, so inclusive of people who've experienced injustices, but also those who might historically have more privilege or access to power. We think that diversity is really important. Thirdly, they're committed to a shared purpose, just like we saw in the RISE research. And in general, they're committed to the purpose of developing all students as leaders, or of tackling educational inequity, or focusing on improving social justice. Finally, and this is really important, they have the relationships and networks that enable them to collaborate and learn together. So they know one another, they have high levels of trust with each other, they have structures and processes for doing work together. Now, if that's what collective leadership is, there are 4 ways we think that collective leadership is being developed in communities, systems, neighborhoods, regions, countries around the Teach for All network. First, through recruitment, bringing people into the collective. Now, typically within the Teach for All network, that's bringing people into the 2-year leadership development program as fellows. But it's also, these days, much wider than that. It might mean recruiting students, parents, school leaders, and others into the work. Secondly, development. So building the capacity of people in the group to work collectively, to lead, shifting their mindsets, building their leadership capacities. Again, that might be the 2-year program, but it's also the development work that's done with alumni, with community partners, with teachers, with students and others. Thirdly, connecting. We think that network partners are making very intentional choices about connecting their cohorts together, connecting with community members, ensuring that their teachers know how to build relationships with their families, students, parents, but it also means building coalitions with other organizations, governments, and so on. We think that active connection is really critical. Finally, we see organizations doing what we're calling convening. That's bringing organizations, people together to create shared plans, shared goals, a sense of shared purpose, to take action together, to learn together about what's working in particular contexts, and to iterate on that as groups. And we're seeing some organizations playing that convening role. Just by way of example, one example, we'll hear a couple more in a second, is the work of Enseña Peru in Ancash in the Peruvian Andes. So there, they've been working for about 8 years in a relatively small community of about 25,000 people with about 7,000 students in schools. They built it on a collective action approach. They built a coalition with the local ministry, a mining company that provided funding. Then they recruited a kind of multi-program approach, about 80 fellows to that region, many of whom have stayed. They also set up programs for existing school teachers, for parents, for school leaders, and for students. So they're developing the capabilities of all of those groups and their mindsets. They connect people very purposefully through deep relationship building, trust building, networking, and they bring people together on a regular basis to act together and plan together. So we have this process called INE, which brings together about 1,000 people in the community every year over the course of 3 days in a very diverse collective of parents, students, teachers, school leaders, policymakers, to reflect on the progress that the region is making, look at the data that they've gathered on how they're doing. And that process is proving to be really effective at that scale, as you can read in the case study about Ancash in the report. They have managed to not only improve the outcomes, learning outcomes in the classrooms of Enseña Peru students, but actually the outcomes of students right across the system through this approach. So it's exciting. So last thing from me, how then are we thinking that these approaches have an impact at the system level? And we'll hear more about this in a second. So the big insight here is that we think change doesn't happen in education in a linear way. You can't just implement a policy or put a new curriculum into place and everything automatically switches. That's not how it works. And that's because education systems are human systems. They're systems that are made up of the daily habits, beliefs, mindsets, capacities, connections, biases of literally tens of millions of people, students, teachers, parents, policymakers. And for that reason, we think they're better understood as complex, dynamic systems. And there, we, like others in the global ecosystem, are leaning on the work of systems theory. And you see this in the RISE research, you see it in Brookings' latest research, you see it everywhere. And that says that we need to understand how those kinds of systems change. So Donella Meadows, this theorist, she says you've got to think about system leverage points instead of linear approaches. And when you think about leverage points, you're thinking about places where you can intervene in a system to get a big outcome elsewhere. And she says that traditionally, the kinds of things you see in the bottom left here, like resources, infrastructure, new policies, are the places we tend to invest in trying to change systems. She says they're not bad bets, but actually they don't have a huge impact on how a system changes. And in fact, they're a bit easier to do. She says that if you really want to transform these complex systems, you've got to think about the stuff in the top right a bit more. Things like shifting the purpose of the system, the mindsets that are in people's head, the goals orienting the system, levels of trust, how people collaborate, who has agency to make change. And she says, if you can shift those things, you'll have a bigger effect on the system. However, they're much harder to shift. It's much harder to shift the ideas that govern the actions of millions of people than it is to implement a new policy. But I think what's exciting for us, and what we'll hopefully hear about a bit in a second, is that we think this act of collective leadership development is already showing promise, perhaps at a smaller scale, of these shifts in purpose, of these shifts in mindsets. And that's why we think it's a great investment, and we want to explore it even further.
We'll now hear from 2 amazing leaders from the Teach for All network who are here with us today. Shaheen Mistry, CEO of Teach for India, and Larissa Hovhannissian, CEO of Teach for Armenia. Welcome, Larissa. Welcome, Shaheen. I would love to begin with you, Shaheen. And first, again, it's really great to have you here with us. And to start us off, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the strategic choices Teach for India has made to transform the wider education systems across around children across the country in India?
I think, Henry, as you asked the question, and just while Alex was sharing as well, I think the disclaimer is I think we understand very little about collective action still at Teach for India. And this is messy and confusing, and we have a lot more questions than answers. But I think some of the things we've tried, one is really focusing a lot on relationships. Like I do think that without cultivating really deep and strong relationships within the community, it's very hard for any kind of like sustainable collective action to happen. So I think that is something we feel very strongly about. I think the second is just discussing what collective action is to be able to understand it better and trying to simplify our understanding of it. I know one of my biggest aha moments came from like a 12-year-old child who's floats around on a video, Teach for India video, but her name is Kusum. And she says, she's asked what collective action is or some such question. And she says, that's so easy. She's like, it's like building a house. You can't build a house alone. Like, you need so many people to come together to build a house. And I think simplifying and understanding that, like, we genuinely do need to come together to create any change. And at the same time, I think acknowledging that it's very difficult to work together as well. And the factors that inhibit us from working collectively are very real. They're issues of ego, they're issues of different mindsets, different value systems. And so I think dialogue and understanding and shared understanding is sort of a second thing we've tried to do. I think a third is just practicing small acts of collective action during the 2-year fellowship itself. So just this morning with our new fellows, we said we have 2 friends on the other side of the world right now who are really struggling with serious health issues, and one of them's going into surgery today. Let's all together, 100 fellows, send them messages of hope and wishes. And that's such a tiny action, but you see the power of the collective, that everybody together sharing a thought, a hope for people, that feels very powerful. So lots of opportunities to practice collective action in small ways. And then I think finally creating real spaces and platforms for people to come together around issues that they want to solve collectively. So we do a lot of spaces both within the fellowship and the organization, but also for our alumni. Some of these are talks where they come together. Some of these are communities of practice where they come to learn together and act together, but different platforms and spaces to actually bring people together. So I guess like get the right people in, bring them together to form strong relationships, and then give them lots of spaces to engage together with things that they care about.
What has the impact of this effort been to develop collective leadership at the community level and also at the systems level?
I mean, I don't know. I keep feeling like the work that we do, certainly, but potentially all of us across the network, is a lot about planting seeds, and we don't really know where those seeds are going and where they will bloom and where they won't. But the numbers, at least at Teach for India, feel encouraging. So we started 15 years ago with 87 fellows. Today we have a community of 5,000 leaders who've completed the 2-year fellowship, and they in turn are working across the system, from policy and governance right down to staying in the classroom. And collectively, that community of 5,000 are directly transforming the lives of 100,000 children. And then the indirect reach is much, much bigger, probably somewhere to the tune of 50 million children across India. So I do think that the Teach For model, by design, is a very powerful multiplier, because it's a depth program. You have to invest very deeply in each fellow, but then over time, there's a very powerful multiplier. And my belief is that systemic change will only happen when we infuse enough leadership at all levels of the system, and also ensure that those leaders are trying their very best to navigate the challenges of working together towards like a shared purpose.
Larissa, it's so great to see you. A question that I have in mind for you is, what are some of the choices Teach for Armenia is making to challenge the logic of the current systems in Armenia, to redefine the purpose of that system?
So at Teach for Armenia, we've been talking a lot about collective leadership, and I think to Shaheen's point, I don't think anyone has it all figured out. And for us, the whole concept, I mean, we've been talking about this for years now at Teach for Armenia and also at Teach for All, but the concept really became more clear to us during the 2020 war that happened in Armenia. There were thousands of people who were displaced, multiple thousands of children were displaced. And all of a sudden, you see our network just sort of come alive and begin responding to something that has never happened before, at least, in the last 30 years. So at this very difficult period when you're sort of scrambling and trying to figure out how to support all of these children, what we saw were communities coming together, teachers and alumni and staff members sort of fanning out into different communities and supporting our children the best they could. And so, I don't think that this sort of response and at that pace and scale could have been possible without a bedrock of relationships that our teachers and alumni had established between each other, but also with parents, with communities, with schools. They worked in lockstep with principals, partners, mayors, governors, and even the national government to coordinate very vital support. And so from this experience, also all of a sudden, we had Teach for Armenia be joined by a lot of different leading nonprofits who are also responding to the emergency and working together. And in Armenia, we don't like working together very much. So it was just so beautiful to see that happen at such a difficult time. And there was this quote in the report that said something along the lines of, sometimes the way we approach the crisis is the crisis. And I think the 2020 war really showed us that if you have a highly connected network of mission-driven leaders who are working together to care for kids, that there is hope even amid a difficult crisis. And so to go back to your decision, when we make strategic decisions about who to recruit, how to develop our teachers and alumni, we really think about how do we build a broad coalition of advocates who can really coalesce around a shared vision. And we look for qualities of people who are able to work together and care deeply for our communities and our students and can work across lines of differences. At this point, Teach for Armenia is in 10% of all public schools. And I don't think that would have been possible had we not been recruiting and developing people to really serve and work through this lens of collective leadership together. I guess my final thought is ultimately systems are made up of people. And so for that reason, I think relationships matter. They matter so much. I think they're probably the most important thing that we have. And so, I think we've been able over the last 10 years of Teach for Armenia's existence to develop those kinds of relationships. And obviously, it's not just our team doing that. It's the hundreds of people who are going through our program and are becoming part of our movement. So yeah, I'd say that those have been the strategic choices we've been making. But again, it's not like it's a algorithm. It's something that we constantly have to think about and rethink and realign around, because also Armenia is changing. What children in Armenia need is evolving. And so I wouldn't say that it's something that we just decide and sort of stick to. I think there's just a general understanding of what kind of people need to be in this work and how they need to approach this work, and then just staying open and agile in terms of what those qualities are and how they can be evolving over time to meet the needs of the country.
I wonder if you can share with us some of the outcome of this investment in building collective leadership in Armenia.
During the war in 2020, we essentially created a program that is called Education in Emergencies, and we've been working with Teach for All a lot on this. We were supporting, 10 to 15% of all displaced students in the country. We saw a need, for example, of there being more programs to support children who are in other areas that we couldn't reach because of capacity. And so we started bringing nonprofits together and really working with them to see if we could conquer and divide. And as I said, again, briefly, we don't like working together for some reason. And I'm just so proud as just an Armenian citizen to say that I think also because of Teach for Armenia's approach and the community that we've built, we've been able to, for example, launch an actual official coalition of leading nonprofits to synergize and coordinate efforts better. I mean, the 2020 war has been continuous. Actually, we've had invasions every year in 2021, 2022, 2023. And so I would say those two things, at least in this lens that I've just been describing, is evidence that I think we're doing something right, because people want to work with our team members, they want to work with our teachers and our alumni. There's trust, and there has been a lot of effort to build relationships and to do it with humility and service. And I think that that's paid off at the right time in a very difficult moment for our country.
I would love to hear both your thoughts on what you are learning about the role and the power of collective leadership to change systems within your context. Shaheen, please go first, then Larissa will take it from you.
I think, the scale of India is so overwhelming with 400 million children in the school system. So it feels like just very, very clear that one organization, a handful of organizations can just do very little when the scale and the diversity of the problem is so staggering. So I think it's a very deep belief across the organization and not the organization, but the community and beyond, that we need to work together if we're going to tip the needle. I think the point I wanted to make that is linked but a little bit different to that is one of our biggest bets is that the collective action, the most important stakeholder in collective action is actually children themselves. And that's an interesting paradigm shift, because I think traditionally most of us in education think that our work is there for children. And yet what we've tried to do at Teach for India is say, what if we were to shift that to our work is there with children? So instead of saying there are 400 million children in India that need to be educated and we as adults will educate them, what if we worked in partnership with those 400 million students to be able to change the system? And I think for me, that's where I've seen the most hope at Teach for India, to see, I mean, I sit here today, we've just brought in our new fellows today, and several of our new fellows are students from our own classrooms, and they are now in the movement with us. But it doesn't need to be just that. Like, can we embed students at every level of our work, from sitting on our advisory boards, our main trustee board, helping out in schools as real problem solvers, doing peer-to-peer learning in the classroom? To me, the most powerful manifestation of collective action that can really shift nations is when we rethink the role of the child itself in the system. And I think that's something that Teach for India is very actively trying to pursue.
Larissa, I would ask you the same question. What are you learning about the role of collective leadership in changing systems within your context?
I love what Shaheen said. I think this very much resonates for us at Teach for Armenia. we've sort of always said that students are the leaders of tomorrow, or like one day they will, you know, do something useful. And it just sort of felt inauthentic, because students are actually leaders today. And I think through the different programs that Teach for Armenia have created, for example, change-based learning, it's our version of project-based learning, you know, something that has never existed in Armenia prior to that. You know, we're seeing students take leadership, ownership, and become leaders within their own communities, and actually truthfully like change outcomes in their communities. One of my favorite projects that our kids did was water filtration system. They realized that the water quality in their village was not great, and so they, you know, drafted a proposal. They created a budget. They talked to the village mayor, who wasn't very supportive you know, in the very beginning, but they, you know, displayed great leadership, and finally, after some time, they got the government essentially to agree to support them, and they completely changed the water quality of their village. This is just one example of hundreds. In Armenia, in a post-Soviet country, you know, mostly people are told that you cannot change anything. The outcomes are predetermined for you. And so over the last 10 years, we've been showing children, working with children, and just sort of paving the way for them to do what they need to do, and to be leaders now, not, you know, in some 10, 15, 20 years down the line. One other thing that I'd like to mention here is Armenia is, you know, a pretty hierarchical country. It's a male dominant society. And so, you know, one thing that we think a lot about is how do we get our women, who comprise, you know, 60-70% of our cohort every year, to lead. And so, you know, we deal with these kinds of country-specific challenges, and we understand that unfortunately we can't just assume that our alumni will have the chance to go into these sectors immediately after they're done with the program and make change. Often our organization actually has to sort of trailblaze or create programs to support our alumni, to even enable them to go into work that we know leads to system reform down the line. And so, you know, positioning, to Shaheen's point again, like positioning our students and all people who are, you know, in our cohort, who are men, who are women, who are young, who are sort of not what people perceive to be leadership now. How do we enable them on an accelerated pace to lead? And so, you know, we sometimes get criticized that Teach for Armenia does too much. And I think it's because we're constantly seeing a need to open up a door. And so, you know, I still think we're definitely on the right track and making the right strategic choices, but it is very hard to sustain. I just saw a question there, like, how do you sustain all these programs? It's very difficult. It's challenging, it's expensive, and it's hard on the team too. So yeah. Lots of questions, not too many answers.
Today, we've also invited Laura Savage as a respondent in our conversation. Laura is the Executive Director of the International Education Funders Group, IEFG. Last year, she also co-edited a book called Systems Thinking in International Education and Development, which presented diverse approaches to applying systems thinking in education, and also question long-held notions of what systems change is. Welcome, Laura. Reflecting on the conversation so far and the findings of the report, how does this all confirm, challenge, or clarify your own thinking on the understanding of how systems change in education? And what recommendations will you make to everyone engaging with us today?
Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Shaheen and Larissa. It's always so incredibly inspiring to hear examples from all of the Teach for All networks around the world. And I welcome this report in particular because it brings together so much of the ideas that have been percolating, at least in the back of my mind, but I'm sure in the back of all of our minds, everyone who's here and listening today, there is just so much in this report and so much in what Larissa and Shaheen have said today that just makes sense, right? And I think that for me is one of the most frustrating things about a career in education is sometimes it boils down to lack of common sense. And in a way, the book that you reference, Henry, I sort of concluded that journey by telling myself I'm not going to use words like system and solution for sure and scale anymore, because when you break down some of the examples of education change that you think should have happened, it just comes down to this really frustrating lack of common sense. And that's kind of what I want to unpack. Because I think everyone in this room, this virtual room here today, is convinced of the need for systems change, if that's what we're going to call it in education. And I really like actually that the definition here is much more succinct, compelling, and purposeful than anyone that we put into our book, that it's the intentional and strategic transformation of a complex system to, one, address pertinent challenges, two, drive towards improved outcomes, and three, challengingly, change the purpose of a system. And that really spoke to me as something that the education community, the global education community, has been missing for a while, is that really clear definition, because we're all frustrated. Every one of us is frustrated. Every day I hear the same questions. Why do proven things not work? Why are we not making progress faster? And I myself felt that frustration back on day one of my job, which is more years ago than I care to remember, many jobs ago. But I was working at the time in the Ministry of Education in Malawi, and I was liaison between the donor group and the government. It was at a time I joined in the 6th year of planning, the 6th year. It took us another year until we came up with an education sector plan. And that's a clue, right? That's a clue. It took 7 years of planning. Meanwhile, you know, the recurrent budget was ticking along. There were all sorts of arguments as to what that final 10%, every director had his hand up, her hand up. Things weren't working faster because we spent so much time planning. The project, the wheels of the projects were in strong motion. And I hear there are incredible things happening in Malawi today, but that feeling, that experience has resonated through almost every role I've had. I've supported teachers, I've supported governments through wholesale teacher reforms, right? So massive curriculum reform, the content of textbooks, needing to get a textbook out to every child in Bangladesh, for example, introducing pre-primary education reforms, shifting from rote to active pedagogy. There are massively ambitious reforms happening to change the structure and coherence of a system, often incoherent. So you know, I think there is a worry that large-scale reform or large-scale systems change means changing everything at once. And that's, again, a clue as to why perhaps some things don't work. But I've also done, you know, I've done my own research on the politics of aid and funded research, including RISE, on what works to improve learning at scale. And I think a lot of the sort of lessons percolating and questions percolating come together into this report. This report really kind of brings it all together. It is a resource here that's full of perspectives and stories of change, real stories of change. And it brings a positive narrative. And I think that's often missing in the education debate that we have. So Henry, 3 things that this report clarified and confirmed for me. First, it's not about what works. It's about the how works. And I think we often forget that, or at least some of the global narrative forgets that. A big part for me, and definitely echoed throughout all of the examples and case studies in this report, are the mantra that it's people and not projects that drive change. And I think that's quite an easy thing to say. I'm hugely excited about the people first development agenda, but the way that the global development industry works, and it's, you know, well-intentioned as it is riddled with incentives that pull in different directions. Accountability to a minister or a taxpayer or a board And that's what results in the linear kind of projectized approaches, this sense of accountability. And Larissa, I think it was something that you said that it really resonated, that this idea of accountability not for the children but with the children. I mean, I've always felt that that's really challenged my thinking, because I've in various roles been accountable to a minister or taxpayer, and always assumed that I'm accountable to the children in the school around the world who aren't receiving the education they should be. But it's a very good point you make. I think there's an irony that many of us in this business critique a sort of global trend of inward-facing politics that we can see in, you know, if we think about politics as inward versus outward, several nations are moving towards a more inward-facing political trend. But isn't that a day-to-day reality we see in our own business, in our own day-to-day work, that there's inward-facing approaches rather than outward? And I think this report really highlights the possibility of being outward-facing. So that's one, the how works, not what works. Second is that we do have shared purpose. We do have shared purpose. We cannot achieve education change alone. And that's so easy to say, but so hard to put into practice. At least that's what I hear. You guys show us otherwise, right? Shaheen, you said that, you know, incentives and egos and all sorts of things pull us in different directions. They pull us into silos. And the RISE program, which Alex referenced and I worked on, underlines the importance of coherence for learning. They called it coherence for learning, and strong accountability relationships. And those moments and relationships up and down this hierarchical school system, as it's described, that hold learning at its core, you know, that hold learning outcomes at the core. But I think what this report says, and what I agree with, is that relationships are not only about accountability, they're about support, shared drive, joint voice, and really powerfully friendship. You know, that feeling that we're not in it alone, we're in it together. And I think what this report really says to me is we need a movement. We've got some of a movement here, but we need a bigger movement. So the third point really that it clarifies relates to that idea of a global movement for education change. And that is that maybe we need to start telling our story more positively. This report tells an incredibly positive story. The experience and story of Teach for All around the world is positive. And one of my takeaways is that we need to celebrate our work as an education community. As I say, I think the examples that Larissa and Shaheen gave today, you know, they gave me goosebumps. I don't know if you found yourself nodding along madly too, but we need more of that in our day-to-day jobs, rather than that frustration that I referenced at outset, that we want to do things. I mean, we all do want to do things faster, but I think that can echo out of the education community into a negative story that doesn't then get heard from some of our other sector peers in climate or health and so forth. So those are my three kind of big wholehearted agreements, and the report has really helped me to sort of solidify and clarify some of those. But I'm still left with three questions as well. And these are questions I don't think are going to go away anytime soon, but I'd hugely appreciate some thoughts and answers to me today on how to do them. So first is, can we create shared purpose? I worry about that a bit, because I think it's really, you know, I agree here, the mindsets and paradigms that we're trying to shift are necessary, but are we all in the education sector trying to shift the same ones? And my interpretation, at least, of systems thinking is we'll never get to that reality. We will all continue to have different incentives and perspectives. So can we accept the bigger version of shared purpose, where, as you say here, that's students thriving? And can we not then dive down into our differences, as we seem to do so much, trying to work out what is our common purpose? Is it for children to learn? Learn what? SEL, FLN? Is it for children to thrive? What does that mean? Should we use the word holistic? Is it for children to grow up and get jobs? No, it's for children to be happy. You know, I think we spend a lot of time doing self-reflection before we get into the, you know, recognize that we all actually do agree. Second question for everyone is, what does this look like in a log frame? And I hate that I asked that question, but the idea of planting a seed and not knowing where it will go, that is exactly what empowered change looks like. but it's really anathema to log frames. And that's, you know, in terms of encouraging recognition of the importance of collective leadership in government and external funding, that's, you know, where the money comes from. What does that look like? And back when I worked at the FCDO, we developed a sort of simple 4-framed logic for thinking about education systems, which was inputs, processes, people, and politics. And this, I think here squarely is the enactment of the people tier of that, that it is about relationships and accountability and friendship. But we're still going to need the inputs. We're still going to need attention to the processes, the procurement, the data, and we're still going to need recognition of the politics that shape all of this. So we found it very easy to put inputs and sometimes processes into log frames. People and politics, much harder. And then third, and my final question, my final thought is, where's the support for networks? And I think Teach for All has led the way. You know, it is the starfish model of networks all over the world that are driving education change through convening, shared learning, joint voice. You know, it's the example for all of us. And there are thousands of other networks out there. To me, I ran a session with Wendy and others a couple of months ago on networks being the manifestation of systems practice, so systems thinking put into practice. Because I think people who work for networks are intuitively systems thinkers. Everyone that works for a network is okay with complexity, believes in the power of relationships, but networks are often run on a shoestring. Members who engage actively in a network are doing it often in their spare time out of passion for it. And this report, I celebrate it most of all because it's one of the very few pieces of real research on education networks. And I'd love to see more of it. So that's, Henry, I'll pass back over to you, but thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak today.
It's just phenomenal to listen to everything you've shared now. And I wonder if Shaheen or Larissa have some thoughts to share back, some sort of response on that as well. I'm going to keep the stage open for them to share their thoughts.
In Armenia's 30-year history after gaining independence from the Soviet Union, this is actually the first few years where we've had the Ministry of Education write a national strategy for the education sector. And Laura, it's great. Like, I think it's, first of all, it's exciting that we have a strategy, and second of all, it's great that, you know, the Ministry of Education here is finally looking at the problems we have in the system and attempting to solve them. But our team is like that annoying little thing, you know, that's buzzing around your ear saying, but you know, how are you going to do it? Like, the what we get, but how are we going to do this, and how are you going to involve all of us? You know, I think to sort of following that point, there's a diagram actually in our report that shows system leverage points. And at the lowest level, you have technical solutions, for example, you know, new teaching methods, and Laura, you referenced that. And then at the highest level, you have terms become a lot harder to manage, such as mindsets embedded within the system itself. And so, you know, I think the work that we're trying to do is actually addressing like the more difficult part of that diagram. And again, I think it's a learning by doing. It's an ongoing process. And what we've seen work really well at Teach for Armenia is piloting an innovation, starting very small, seeing how it works, collecting good data on it, and then feeding that to the Ministry of Education. Now, whether they'll take it or not, we're not sure. But so far, they've been pretty open to it because, once again, like, I think our organization is creating a new standard of where you don't just make decisions sort of emotionally or through hearsay, but you can actually show what's possible to affect in terms of outcomes, for example, in terms of people's engagement, et cetera. And so we actually have 2 projects that I'm very proud of. that have been approved and actually now being scaled. I know it's not a nice, it's not a word you like very much, Laura, but is being offered to the educational system. So I referenced change-based learning, which is our version of project-based learning. And now, at first we had to do it after school, and then they saw the results, they loved it, and now essentially all schools should do project-based learning based on our experience. And then we have a school turnaround program that effectively shows that if you support educators through ongoing training for 2 years and you deeply believe in their potential and love them and care about them, that those very same people who've been in this work for a very long time can have completely different results in their classrooms. So it's a balance of keeping and protecting the human aspect of our work, and then having the necessary systems in place to collect the data and make better decisions for ourselves as an organization and hopefully for the government. So I'll stop there, but it's an exciting time, and for us personally at Teach for Armenia, it's just been exciting to be at the 10-year mark, because more and more a lot of the work that we're doing is actually addressing the harder stuff of our system and of this report, actually.
3 things that we're thinking about, like that I think I thought of and was sparked by your thoughts. The first is, like, while we may debate the purpose of education, I think it's a beautiful question, like, can we create actually shared purpose? I think at minimum, can we start aligning on expanding the definition of education to be more meaningful and to go beyond self? And I think we found that very mobilizing. Like, if we can expand the idea of education just being about me and my success in life, to education being about me and my ability to uplift and create opportunities for others and my ability to create a better world, that definition feels like one that many more people can come together around. So that's one thing we've been thinking about. I think the second is, your question on, like, that, or your thought on the how matters. One aspect of the how do we collectively lead is a really, really interesting question. And I think one of the things that we've tried to experiment a lot with at Teach for India, I think inspired by our legacy in our country of Gandhiji as well, is the idea of leading with love, and the idea that might be a much slower process, but will be hopefully much more sustainable, and one where we're not fighting the system. And I think you referenced a lot of frustration, and I hear that a lot in my own country. But the idea that we don't have to work against the system, but what does it mean to partner with the system with love, even when it's difficult, to take steps forward and collectively? And I found again that just the value of love, again, defined in its broadest sense. Can I love myself, my work, my children, the people I work with, the country, the world? That feels like a very empowering idea to bring people together around. And the third, and I loved what you started by saying, I don't like these words, and I don't like those words either. I think for me, the whole question of, like, is it like scale? Is it depth? Is it like, it just feels like a false question to me today, 35 years into the work. The idea now for me that feels very real is this idea that real depth enables a very powerful ripple and multiplier. And so unless we're invested in real depth, whether it's like the quality of leadership training we give to a teacher, the quality of education we give to a child, it is only when that happens that I've seen a very, very powerful, again, sustainable ripple happen. And so this sort of idea that, like, depth is the ultimate multiplier, and that, like, how do we also become a little bit more comfortable in a world where we're looking for outcomes and impact as of today? How can we balance that with the faith that some of this is planting seeds for the future? and we're not going to be able to see it. And we still need to take consistent steps with love towards that shared purpose that we think about.
I see this question by Shalav, who asks that in collective leadership systems, the learning aspect of innovation, feedback, and reflection was not elaborated. I would like to know how they fit in terms of systems change and in relationship with technical and collective leadership. Alex, again, we don't have the time. Can you answer this as part of your final thoughts?
Sure, and thanks everybody for joining today. I always want to do two responses as we close out. So one on this question of learning at the system level. We haven't really touched on it. I think we have a bit. So how does this leverage point of learning work? Well, I think Larissa's example of generating innovations within a system that are then adopted. We see in all of the research in the RISE program, there's a theory of how systems adapt. So it's about how you mobilize the whole system and people in it to use evidence, data, to inform decision making that then changes what the system does. So the example I shared of Ancash as well earlier, that process of bringing 1,000 people together every year to look at how things are going, that's a system learning and taking new actions as a result of that learning. And please look at the report to go deeper into that. And then secondly, I just wanted to, thanks for those pushes, Laura. I thought they were great. And you talked about that framework just of inputs, processes, people, and politics. I do think that one of the next frontiers for us as a network is thinking about the politics of change and how that relates to the people side as well. One of the reasons why as a network we are pleased to work with civil society organizations is that hopefully they exist beyond the cycles of political change and create something that's sort of firmer and more permanent within education systems. But that is a frontier for us where I know lots of people are interested to dig in further. And so just by way of closing, I would love to say thanks to everybody who contributed on the call today, to all of our panelists, for you guys for being here. And thank you to everybody who helped us put this report together and the thousands of people that contributed to that over the past few years. I urge you to download it, read it, and then get back in touch with us. If you'd like us to come and run workshops or speak to people, or you will have questions or further things you'd like to do, we would love to engage further with you. The report will be coming in an email shortly after this call, so everybody who signed up will have access to the link. And then it's being translated into a further 11 languages. It will be available in those languages within about 2 weeks from now. So lots of people have access to it. And it's been generated in the spirit of learning. So it's just a snapshot in time. There's lots more learning that we intend to do with you and others. So thanks for being here in this process with us. Thanks to our panelists again. And Henry, back to you.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to all our speakers today and everyone else behind the scene who made this conversation possible. And of course, to you, our audience, for coming and for engaging. We've come to the end. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.